I don't know about you, but I'm a spoiled child. In the background here you see the demo of Sons of Valhalla, the current demo. There was an older demo that came out in the Next Fest 2023, and that's what I originally played, and man, there was one thing that really bothered me in it. The text speed was very slow, and pressing the confirm button would immediately go to the next text box, forcing you to either read text very slowly or skipping dialogue. They've improved that, luckily. As you can see, we can now tap confirm once while the text is still coming in, and it'll display the whole text, and then pressing it one more time will go to the next text box. That's how it should be. Kind of. This is still, honestly, very subpar. And the reason I say this is, if we look at the options menu, seriously, what is this? This is way below my standards. Look at the lack of actual settings here. There's a dialogue speed setting. Goes from slow to very fast, and that's it. Now, this might not look wrong to you at all. This might look standard to you, but then I know you have not played a lot of Japanese porn games. And if you care about UI, UX, if you are a UI or UX designer, you should play Japanese porn games. And if you don't believe me, I hope this video can convince you otherwise, and show you just how amazing the world of Japanese porn game UX actually can be. To start out, let's look at a game that first blew my mind in this regard, Alchemy Meister Kamidori. So first we have some toggles for confirmations. These are the "Are you sure you really want to do this" pop-ups. You can disable these. Not very granular in this case, but hey, it's better than nothing. We have animation toggles, we'll look at those a little bit again later. Next we have automatic cursor movement. This is a concept that also appears in a couple of these games, we'll see it again later. This is used to automatically move the mouse cursor onto relevant UI elements as you, say, change state. So for example in Rance Quest's battle system, this is also a thing where you select an attack, and then it'll automatically move the cursor onto an enemy. So all you have to do is basically double-click the attack, and it'll automatically attack a certain enemy. And then at the very bottom there, we have some much more game-specific things to configure. Things like ending your turn automatically after all units have moved, automatically selecting a next character once you've moved a character. This is an SRPG sort of thing, you'll see. So these are all really nice to have. Next, let's move on to the text portion. And oh boy. Look at all the options we have here. For one, we have text display speed on a nice slider. We can be as granular as we want with our text display speed. I mean, just crank it up to maximum, honestly, always. The next thing we have here is also very important, and that is the auto advance delay. So there's an auto mode. This is also a very standard feature in most VNs in general. Even though this is not a VN, I'd like to stress. It has VN elements, but this is an actual game. You'll see. So this will determine just how long the text will stay on screen when you're in auto mode. And nice touch, you have separate options for voiced and unvoiced text to make sure that you get to hear all the voice acting if you really want to. And then we even have a font selection. That is also something that a lot of these games will have, but not necessarily all of them. And then we can also adjust the highlighting effect the text gets. And then we can also customize the message window a little bit. All some relatively standard features that we see in a lot of these games, but still very nice to have. That is honestly disgustingly little settings. We'll see much better examples later. And now we go to the character tab. This is something that is relatively common in a lot of VNs and Eroge, and it lets you disable the voice acting of specific characters. Also note, sometimes they come with, and this maybe makes a little more apparent why this exists, especially in the context of Eroge, a generalized all males and all females switch. Not in this case. You can actually adjust the text color of every character individually, which is something that I don't think I've seen in other games. Note that something that a lot of games will also do is actually hide the names of characters that you haven't seen yet in the story, to prevent spoilers. I'm not sure if the game is doing that or all the empty slots at the bottom are actually like just placeholders that are there in the engine, I don't know. Now let's jump in game, and one thing you also note here is a very nice New Game Plus menu. I haven't unlocked any of the options yet. That's what I like to see. Now let's show off the power of the skip button. Also, honestly, a very important UX feature. And here we go. As I said, it's an SRPG-ish thing. We move units around on tiled things, and this is a nice thing. If we don't move the cursor for a while, this is also a setting by the way, it'll show us some UI hints as to what we're actually looking at. Also, option to skip the tutorial, very nice. And now, you know, we move our guy around a little bit, explore the dungeon. As you can see, there's animations for moving around, there's animations for combat here, which, you know, they're cool to look at, but they're a little time consuming, aren't they? We can actually switch these off. Go to the config, and now we go in the basic menu. You can see animations, set everything to off. This is what it looks like now. Much faster. There's still those clashing blades. I wish you could disable those. But oh well. Much more playable than Tactics Ogre already. Now, speaking of snappy SRPG experiences, let's take a look at Rance IX. In the settings, first we'll find a lot of the standard things, nothing too elaborate in this one. You can see we have our text display speed, auto mode weight, not with the voiced toggle because there are no voices in this game. The text settings are a little disappointing as far as color and font go. We don't have much of a choice. We can only set the color for text that has been read or is in the backlog. However, we do get a bunch of nice settings for the skip and auto modes. Then we have some text window settings, which honestly almost pointless. I mean, the transparency is nice, but why would we want to adjust the brightness like this? We cannot adjust the text color. Oh well. Still better than nothing. Now, sound, kind of disappointing as well, though we do get to mute the game, or not, when we toggle out of it. That's nice. I've seen this in a lot of non-porn games too, actually, lately. Now here we have more input settings, also relating to auto movement of the cursor. We've mentioned that before, and there are some interesting things as to when to show the mouse cursor. And we can also set whether we want mouse scroll up to show the backlog or the back scene. We'll talk about that later. And then, since this is actually a 3D game, we get a lot more elaborate graphics settings. There's actually some pretty interesting things down here. For example, the ability to set the window to stay open even though set the game to be inactive. This is very nice when you have multiple monitors and you want to have the game open on your second screen. Also something that I've seen here and there in newer games, especially AAA games, but something that porn games have been doing for ages. And then here we have a whole bunch of 3D settings. This is mostly standard stuff if you've played, well, any other 3D game, but it is actually kind of novel for a Eroge to have this guys. And here we have also the already known confirmation settings. Again, a lot more granular than in Kamidori, but kind of standard stuff. So why am I showing this game? Well, let's start a new game and look at the combat tutorial, because that's really where some of the neat things are in this. Note, again, a very powerful skip mode that lets us get into the game pretty quickly. I should also say I really do like the general button layouts and designs in a lot of these games. And there's probably some spoilers on screen right now that I censored a little bit. Now, this tutorial, by the way, only appears if you play the game for the first time or in the Start Fresh mode. Any other modes will not have these tutorial pop-ups, but they're not too bad. Now, here we go, another tile-based or TRPG kind of experience, and I mean, just being able to play these with a mouse makes them so much better than with a controller usually. And you might have noticed there was no movement animation. That's actually because I've already disabled these. Because you see, at the bottom of the screen here, at the bottom right, we have some buttons that let us change the animation settings in real time. We have on the very left the comet animation speed, then we have the auto camera movement, which will move the camera close in a little bit, zoom in a little bit for attacks, enable that, and then we have the movement animation speed. And with the comet animations set to the lowest speed and the movement animations on, also on the lowest speed, you can see it takes quite a while to go through an enemy turn. So let's turn these up to max, but still have everything on, and that's already much better. However, we can go even further and turn all of these off. Well, let's keep the comet animations on, just so you can see the difference between camera movement on and off. And here's another interesting thing. So we're now doing a special move. We've turned the comet animations off. You've seen there was literally no animation for that. Everything is nice and snappy. Let's charge up our special gauge again so we can... I do want to show off the animations a little bit. And there's an interesting thing here. Even with the comet animations off, you might see that below our main action buttons, we have the other button that says show animation. We'll get to that in a second. But this is what the animations will usually look like if you don't skip them for the special moves. They're not super atrocious compared to some other games, I know, but still, having the ability to just skip them outright is very nice. Now, what if you really like those animations though, and you want to see them, but you don't want to keep toggling between the on and off combat animation setting? Well, the game actually accounts for that as well. Under the action buttons, there's another button called Show Animation. So even when you have the animations disabled, you can click that button to show the animation for that attack in particular, which is a really neat feature. And not just that, since this is another thing, another little thing they added in the game, of course there's a separate setting for this that only is accessible in game by going to this additional config button, where you can now swap whether the main button, the big button, is the one that skips the animation or the one that shows the animation. I'm not sure I've seen this in any other game, and I kind of like it. Now for our next game, why don't we stick with an Alisoft game that came out shortly after Rance IX, namely...
Evenicle.
Now, as far as the settings go, not that much has changed from Rance IX. There are some additional settings, especially in the sound tab, for example. We have some interesting things for lowering the volume or muting it. In some instances, input stuff is basically the same. The 3D and Windows settings are basically the same. The game settings have some interesting things for different movement options, a general speed up battles button, which is nice, and also the option to use the censored CGs. For those not in the know, generally in Japan, eroges are actually censored. They cannot show genitalia. But then for Western releases, some localizing studios anyways uncensor these CGs. Which, however, sometimes also means showing off art that was never really meant to be seen. And therefore was also not, well, made with a lot of effort, let's say. I wouldn't recommend using the censored CGs to stream on Twitch, by the way. But now, as far as UX goes, aside from the general niceness of the buttons, etc., here's an interesting thing. In the field menu, as they call it, we can select some of these items in our menu by these checkboxes, up to 4 only, sadly. And then they will appear at the bottom of the screen for shortcuts, which is really nice. Another thing that I want to show off here is the backscene function. Most people are familiar with a backlog that just shows the previous messages, but the backscene function in Evenicle goes a little further even. As you can see, it even shows you various game-related messages, and it even records the UI state. If you pay attention to the money gauge, the encounter gauge at the top left, or the love gauge, you can see that as we scroll through the backscene here, it actually even accounts for that, which is kind of neat. And of course, you can also replay voiced lines wherever appropriate. This goes a little beyond what average VNs have, though more elaborate backscene systems like this have been catching on a little bit lately. Still, very nice thing to have. Now, on to our next game, a relatively recent game, which, despite having some interesting things going on here as well, on top of the usual buttons, like our little star ratings here, they act a little like bookmarks. Something is wrong, we can't seem to skip text. So let's go to the settings, check these out, see if we can maybe change this. So first off, you'll see, again, a lot of the standard things, like auto heights for cursors, auto movement for the cursor. Here we don't have very granular prompt control, sadly, but we do have some of it. For some reason, it doesn't go to off. Very few is the lowest it goes. A very interesting feature also is that we can switch the positioning of confirm and cancel buttons. So if we have a yes/no pop-up, we can change whether yes is on the left or no is on the left. So text settings, well, it's alright. I mean, you have text speed, which is very important. We have the midline click settings. That's the thing that determines whether clicking while a line is being displayed, the full text is displayed or the next is displayed. That's the thing that Sons of Valhalla did wrong initially. They fixed it. Though having the prompt or the settings always better. So in the sound and voice settings, again, your relatively usual character-specific voice settings. Some other things, the voice continue, also a very standard thing. There's a couple of different ways of going about this. And we even have some key binding settings, which, weirdly enough, not actually very common in Eroge. Usually there just simply aren't a lot to begin with, I guess. And then there's another thing we have here. There's the advanced settings button at the top right. And that one is a little interesting. In order to really show you what this does, I have to switch to desktop recording, because it actually opens a separate system pop-up with a whole bunch of other settings. These are more related to the technical details of display, though we also get things like a font choice here, which is very interesting. We can also adjust the window size in windowed mode. These are generally a lot more technical things, but it's also nice to have. But interesting that it has to open in this, well, separate window. I guess anybody who would want to fiddle with these settings wouldn't mind this anyways. It immediately screams, these are advanced settings that you maybe shouldn't mess with if you don't know what you're doing. Also, something you'll find very often with Japanese games here, a policy on what to capture and how to share it. Some games actually open with statements like these and will tell you very explicitly that from a certain point on you're not allowed to even stream a game anymore, or similar things. Now, one thing I also want to show, this is what the combat / main gameplay of the game looks like, and of course there's a button to speed everything up. And if you think that you have no idea what just happened, well, the game does give you the option of looking at a little breakdown of what happened in the battle log. Also, we fixed the skip mode, so that also works relatively well now. It's honestly one of the slower skip modes I've seen in these games, so some points deducted there. Now if you skip ahead a little bit, here's another interesting thing I want to show. You see at the top of the screen, you have these little left click, right click buttons. You can change what left and right click do in real time on any of these screens. You can make them act like shortcuts to basically any other screen. As long as you hover over something that isn't a button and then left or right click, it'll bring you to whatever screen you selected at the top. So basically it acts a little like a screen shortcut hotbar. And while it's only limited to left and right click and only the pre-selected set of screens, it is a pretty neat feature, and something more expansive in this vein would be pretty neat to have in basically any game that has a lot of menus. Now let's leave the realm of video games and enter the realm of visual novels. Because you might think that visual novels are relatively simple, but I swear most of these have a lot more settings than whatever indie game you've made. So here we have Making Lovers, and screen settings, nothing super special there. Also, one of the other ones that has some keyboard shortcuts. But yeah, you can see there's not too much there. Still nice to have. Now here we have the so-called system settings, and again, a lot of standard things, but nothing too extraordinary here. Overall, it's a little sparse. We do get to assign the mouse shortcuts here as well. And we also have the prompt settings, you know, the usual stuff. And then, of course, the individual character voice settings. No text settings here, sadly, but it is nice. And then we get to the text settings. A little more elaborate than in some other games. We do get a choice of font, which is nice. We do get things like the voice interruption, etc. But for the most part, nothing too special here. With the exception, maybe, of the choice at the very bottom there. The H-scene setting, as it's called. This is one of the eroge where, during the H-scenes, the player is actually asked on their preferred nutting location. And this happens via a prompt that interrupts the scene. This is a choice that would repeat in every single scene, disrupting the flow, for someone who already knows that, say, they have a huge preference for cream pies. So instead of having that happen and disrupt the scene, you can just set here if you have a preference, and it will automatically pick that choice without interrupting the scene with the prompt. Now, I'm pretty sure you can think of applications of similar settings outside of porn games. Let's say a Mass Effect game where you get to set that you just automatically always pick the Renegade option, because you already know that's what you pick every single time. Why make me pick manually when I just know what I want? Another interesting setting here, by the way, is the text window display mode setting. So now, currently, everything looks pretty normal. You have your text box at the bottom, overlaid over the background. But if we go and change the setting here, well, it is now actually not overlaid over the background. We just get a separate section in the window just for text display. Can't say that I've seen a lot of VNs with this setting, but I kind of like it. Now last, but certainly not least, let's take a look at No Thank You. Probably the most extensive in terms of settings we have here today. I really like what this game has going on here. There's a lot of customizability. None of these settings on their own are super unique, but it's probably the most comprehensive. Also, I really like AVN that has a dedicated playstyle tab in its settings. Oh, by the way, here's a reference sheet for all the shortcuts, which is really nice. But yeah, look at the playstyle setting. In AVN, I'd like to point out, again. So for one, there's settings for a whole bunch of visual effects, which is very nice. There's the cinematic auto mode, since this is a heavily voiced game, so why even display text boxes? And then we have 3 different auto mode advanced settings here, which is really nice and pretty much self-explanatory. And also note at the bottom, you have a little explanation for all the settings as you mouse over them. Again, very little here in terms of being very unique so far. Actually, this is a nice one, the collect CGs. There are some scenes, right, where you might get some H scenes, that is, where you get slight variations of the scenes depending on what choices you make. And with that scene, with that setting, you can just make it collect all the possible variations just by having seen one of them. Which is nice and saves you some trouble of replaying the game with all the possible choices, trying to keep track of what scenes you've collected and what you haven't. And we've just seen in Making Lovers the nutting location choice. Here we have it even more granular, with a differentiation between fellatio and penetrations. Very, very nice. By the way, I don't think in any of these games these choices carry any consequences, sadly, outside of some variations in the scenes. If you're aware of a game that actually does model at least one of the plethora of imaginable consequences that these choices could actually bring with them, I'd be very interested to know, because I think that's exactly the kind of thing that would make one of these games very interesting. Then we move on to the Visuals tab, where again we are presented with a lot of options. Nothing super out of the ordinary here, but everything presented very nicely, and we do have just a good selection of choices here. Just very little to complain about. I do think it's a shame when a game doesn't offer font selection and color selection for the text entirely, but oh well. It is alright. Now, here we have, as usual, the individual character sound settings. There's also an interesting setting here for looping voices automatically, so you don't have to spam a button if you want to hear a voice line over and over. One thing that's also very nice is the granular volume control, which lets you mute the H-scene sounds of characters separately from their normal dialogue sounds. And then, of course, a whole separate screen just for configuration settings. Just a really nice showing. And here, by the way, character options. Here's actually something that I haven't seen in any other game. In addition to the individual volume sliders, look at this, we even have body hair settings, which is something that I really don't expect from many games. And then we can also do volume sliders for the sub-characters. But yeah, that body hair setting, also extra points. Really high grades here. Now let's cap this off with some footage from Mamatoto, a 1999 game, which doesn't have that much to offer in terms of settings, but UX is a little more than just the settings, and I do think this game holds up also pretty well. There's a very rich history of Japanese PC games. It's just that most of them happen to be porn games. I don't know why, it just happened that way. There are some non-porn games, of course, coming from Japan, some really good ones. Stuff like the ATC series or A-Train. But for whatever reason, porn games just seem to dominate there. But make no mistake, just because these are porn games doesn't mean there isn't a whole lot of things to like about them. Outside of the porn, of course. In fact, the porn at this point is probably the least interesting element of porn games to me. I'm not kidding when I say that the most exciting thing about playing a new Eroge for me is always looking at the settings, and I hope I was able to show why. Keep in mind that everything I showed here is just a tiny glimpse into the very rich world of Japanese Eroge, and it's limited entirely to the stuff that's available one form or another in English. I don't actually speak Japanese, and I swear they keep the best stuff from us. If I made people a little curious to delve into this very, very rich world of design and video game history, I can recommend Manga Gamer and Just as your go-to stores for Japanese Eroge, and if nothing else, I just hope I gave some people some good ideas for how to improve UX in video games in general.